Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and if we can make but maybe after it will work. Yeah, I have to rush another meeting before the deadline. So I want to keep track of the events. No, I'm going to. Great. After night,
Test this.
Oh,
Yeah. Is it better here? The handheld? Okay. Okay. That's what I'll do. Good morning, and thank you for coming. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Wes Geisenberger. I have helped lead a group called the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Funds. And as part of the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund, we provide funding and support for digital solutions, digital public goods, often all built on Hedera Hashgraph. The fund exists to grow the sustainability economy on Hedera. We try to do so in very short time periods using these accelerated open source technologies. And these technologies that we invest in allow people to build the world's applications that solve climate problems, solve people problems in climate, solve coordination problems around the world. The solutions are being built across what we call the Hedera Guardian ecosystem. And as part of the Hedera Guardian ecosystem, what we're looking to do is coordinate these series of decentralized actors in climate markets, in emissions reporting, in investment, in order to tackle the world's challenges. And as part of what we see as some of those challenges, we have trust, transparency, problems across these parties. We may not be able to see the information that we're working with very easily. It may be hidden behind a PDF. PDF from one company is built from a PDF from another company, which is built from a database from another company, and we don't have that source information of what may have come from the field, from a satellite. And of course, all this data can be used to create attributes. But if we only have the last form of data that was received by the party before us in the value chain, we may not be able to actually predict proper pricing. And of course, that also means the folks who created that data don't necessarily have access to the financial benefits of the market because they're 2, 3, 4, 5 times removed, not just from a trade, but from the assets creation. Maybe even the project developer who's helping them can't necessarily take all the information because it's going to somebody who has to validate or verify the information before a registry can say that this is true. But when someone's emitting, it may be too far away to actually know the source of emissions to the person who declares it to be an emission. And of course, how do we do this better? How do we predict what the future will hold is through standards, through ways to coordinate, to define, to collaborate. And that's what we work on Hedera. We have 5 goals that we've defined over our 3-4 years working in this area and 2+ years since we launched the fund. And so those goals are making climate finance auditable, understanding where money is coming from, where it's going to. We can't understand equity until we understand who's getting paid. Of course, we need to know the rules that they're getting paid under. Digitizing and open sourcing methodologies is our second goal. We've built the largest methodology library in the world, digitizing open source rule sets in climate markets, both emissions, offsets, working in biodiversity methodologies and standards that underlie them. But those rules, they have to have data that run through them. It tells you who's saying what. So, of course, if you don't have those rules, you can't see who's getting paid if you don't know who's saying that or testing that piece of information. That information though needs to be independently verified. So our third goal is scaling, validation, and verification. Today, most of the world's validation and verification bodies in carbon markets, they're not in the global south, but oftentimes in the US, China, EU. And of course, we need to have folks who are represented equitably. We have to have information that's attested in a publicly audited way that's consistent against those digital rule sets. And only once we have verified information that can be trusted, following sets of rules built on standards that we know where the money comes from to those specific parties involved in the creation process of an asset, then can we discover a price of that asset that's truly equitable? And of course, we need to discover a price based on data, not just a brand. Of course, if we have a brand and we're trying to sell an asset in a brand-driven way, we may not need the rules. It's just buying based on brand, not based on quality of the data, quality of the information, and real impact. And these assets should live on a balance sheet. If we're a company reporting our emissions, and we're supposed to granularly report these emissions in an institutionally accepted way, based on data, we probably should have assets that, when we declare net zero, are equally granular in nature. Of course, when we work with these assets, when we declare net zero, we need to prove every step along the way back to the source. And that's really what the 5 goals are about. And so here we think it's possible through this ecosystem: enhanced credibility, customization of new rule sets to iterate on. We, of course, think that when we do that, we'll be able to build new attributes based on where pricing comes from. If we have a bond that we want to create these new types of attributes, we've heard all throughout COP about different types of biodiversity bonds, blue bonds, all different types of areas. And we have folks like Evercity in our ecosystem who are creating all types of new assets, say carbon-linked bonds. We want to know where those funds go to. We think that we can follow those flows to specific actors and understand how that relates back to communities. And of course, if we can understand how that relates back to communities, we can better create new attributes in our markets. And if we understand those relationships in the context of the rules, we can then compare those methodologies and improve them over time. And we can base that on not just static data based on the PDFs today, which is a much more simple analog process. We can have much more complex rule sets where we can build methodologies and apply based on what project information and data is available, open the market to new participants, get real-time granular updates so we know when projects are in trouble, not only after a reversal. We can understand in the context of data what should be private, what should be public. Oftentimes, if you go to a PDF today on a voluntary market registry, you may find information that you'd be surprised is there. And we need to find ways to make sure we protect privacy of individuals, of land stewards, of different companies involved. But on the emission side of the equation, we need to protect the information that's considered confidential so companies are able to share granularly without compromising their secrets. And of course, when we audit, we need to make sure we account for the standardized format so the audits are efficient. Our validation and verification is efficient. One of the big backlogs we hear in the market is that projects aren't getting to market because they're stuck with a verifier. And oftentimes, if a project's spending $50,000 on a verifier, but they're based in the global south, they may not have access to the market in a way that's considered economic, but that's also may not be equitable if they're paying prices from a country 3,000, 5,000 miles away when local currency doesn't get them as far as the local currency would in the global north country. And of course, what can we do with all this standardized rule sets, all this information around finance, all the information around the more effective audits? We can develop machine learning models that actually bring these data points as attributes into the price of a credit. So when we have a price of a credit, we can look at this data in high resolution, understand first the depth of the data in a model, and we can understand the breadth of the information. What we'd like to call it is, instead of a black and white PDF in 2 dimensions, we can get to the data in 3D in color. We can understand that the information is real back to the source, whether it's a sensor, a person, a satellite. We can get to the breadth of information based on an attribute, such as financial equity. How much money has actually gone to the community versus the contractors involved? Is data insured against political risk, forward risk from a delivery perspective? Is it insured against reversal? Are we thinking about elements, are we using the right tools to actually measure? Do we have the full context? And ultimately what that can enable is a market that looks a little more like a price productivity market like Zillow in the US, where you can predict the price of a house based on different attributes, based on different elements that you would have to consider if you were living. You wouldn't just buy a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom house and say it's all commoditized. And a carbon credit is no different. Even your emissions profile, it has different characteristics that you may want to match up, or your company may have values based on how you want to buy a credit. And that price productivity is an important element of that. And of course, these assets will live on your balance sheet. And so we better have the equally granular institutional way to account following open source rules, clear data structures that we can prove are real. We need to understand
not just our scope 1, 2, and 3 footprints and how they relate to each other, scope 3 or scope 2 as indirect emissions to scope 1, but product carbon footprints that can be decarbonized with credible carbon offsets attached, credible biodiversity credits attached, depending on what type of impact those products have. And that all is related together in an ecosystem for us at the foundation. So we put these goals into action at multiple layers. So at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about how this was all built on Hedera in our ecosystem. And what the HBAR Foundation does is we're a force multiplier. What we do is through our open source code that lives on top of Hedera, we provide technical guidance for all the folks who are building on Hedera. We provide R&D and capacity building through our DLT Earth initiative alongside the DLT Science Foundation, which was started by University College of London. We then take these facilities, whether it's through hackathons, which we'll be talking about more today, where we have $100,000 to help further methodology development, where there's going to be over a dozen prizes given out for new digitized and open source methodologies that are well documented. We're sponsoring fellows with one fellow, all based in the Global South, matched to each of those 5 goals that we just talked about to study the impacts of our ecosystem. We're funding against those goals, but making sure the projects who are being funded are successful through this technical advice. And they're all building on this open source series of repositories like the Guardian. And there's applications who then use that code to accelerate and get to market faster because they can build an open source and digitized methodology in under 2 weeks oftentimes. And they build not just code sets that are based on the methodologies or the data, but wrap around code sets to serve the carbon markets, whether they're exchanges, emissions reporting platforms, ESG reporting platforms, green bonds, carbon forwards, you name it. Folks are building it, and those applications may have users that are either other applications or end customers. It could be businesses, consumers, and they're working with folks who catalyze change in the community. All of these projects that are driving real world impact that need an ecosystem of support based on a trusted layer that is fully digital and structured in a way that everyone can understand, that's auditable. They have information that's auditable, that's discoverable, and they have assets that are liquid in the market. And so what if we delve into that a little deeper, when these pieces work together, we have a layer of trust built on Hedera, the hash graph. We have a series of applications on top of that that look at how we can explore the information. We can sign and attest for data in wallets, just like you would in a DocuSign or a digital signature. We have a specific protocol to follow the rules for all of these applications in emissions reporting, finance, projects, trading, and compliance and disclosure. And those users represent an ecosystem of change, an ecosystem of folks who are driving change in the Netherlands, South Africa, Namibia, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire. We have folks from Alcott who've taken their entire project portfolio and announced they're going to be digitizing it in this way, which represents hundreds of projects around the world. We have a national telco in Southeast Asia, folks in Eastern Africa, folks in Singapore who've started to take renewable energy certificates. And they're all doing the same thing. They're trying to make assets auditable using the Guardian through the applications and platforms that are working with them to help change their communities and enabling them. And the list goes on and on. It could be folks who are buying energy, folks who are offsetting emissions, folks who announced even yesterday, the government of India is helping retire and recycle vehicles using CDM methodologies. Those are the types of folks who are driving change. But it's not just startups and communities. It's large-scale enterprise organizations, some of the same ones that govern Hedera, who are driving real-world impacts. And so ServiceNow has launched renewable energy certificate applications where they're using Hedera as the base layer, the Guardian via API, and its open source capabilities to deliver through the ServiceNow platform for specific implementations that account for renewable energy credits, doing measurement reporting and verification at a granular level to make sure that the assets are real and they can tell the customers exactly how they're used. And you can see that exactly on Hedera for every renewable energy certificate that represents a megawatt hour, what it looks like. And it's not just accessible for the enterprise. We try to make the code easy to use, following specific workflows. So in one of our hackathons last year, somebody took the gold standard Cookstove methodology, TPDD Tech, and they took this entire mapping across project proponents, registries, and VVBs, and they mapped it out. They built an entire methodology line by line. They compared it to the other cook stove methodologies in our ecosystem that have already been digitized. And what they did is they built an entire chain of trust all the way from the inception and registration, creating a policy, listing projects, reviewing it, to issuing an asset. And what's possible when we do that is folks can build the rule sets quickly, but they can also map to new outcomes. And one of the key outcomes that we talked about a little bit was financial equity. And I want to get into that of what does public financial transparency look like when we take a methodology, all the roles and actors laid out, just like we saw, and get into mapping financial flows going into the same accounts on a public ledger as to where the data came from. And what we can understand is through an asset, say it's a tokenized asset, such as a carbon credit, that's linked to every role, what we can get to is following a financial flow when a forward is traded, a spot asset is traded like a credit, and we can calculate the total value. And we can then calculate the percentage of funds that remits back to registries, verifiers, project proponents, and even community wallets to calculate the percentage to the community. But then we can even follow it from the community wallet to when it's off taken and the data of where that finance was used, whether it goes to a third party who's delivering services to the community, say public goods like a well, or it could be something much more direct, like financial remittance for work on a project. And we achieve transparency and auditability, but also financial clarity of where does our money go in this market? Who benefits? I think that's something that if we really want to achieve successful, equitable climate finance, we need to think about who is benefiting and think about what's reasonable in terms of benefit and how does that inform our market. Of course, we can only do that on a public ledger, and we always have to consider that these assets are oftentimes being bought by corporates or countries, depending if it's an IPMO under Article 6, or if it's something like a carbon credit in the voluntary market. And so in a supply chain setting, we have folks like Avery Dennison, one of our governing council members, who've announced they have a connected product cloud, which is to track billions of items on Hedera with digital product passports. Of course, what do you do with that? You're able to take information along a supply chain. You're able to use emissions methodologies that are mapped with equal granularity to what you just saw in the carbon markets to understand what is happening. Of course, that changes if it's scope 1, 2, or 3, but also product carbon footprints. And in the case of Avery Dennison, they're able to understand every single event because they're the world's largest digital label company. And so what they're able to do is when you go through in carbon accounting, they can actually offset and enable these carbon reduction tokens, is what they call them, and go request a token offer from folks like Tollum in our ecosystem and enable offsets on the fly with granular information. And when we go to enable our planet's balance sheet, we can actually prove from the source of the emission, from the products, all the way through the value chain of a minted carbon emissions token, tied to a carbon offset that is fully granular, supported by the ecosystem, exactly what has happened in bringing our balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger. So with that, I'd like to pass the mic over to Matthew Lawrenson to talk a little bit more about how these markets work, how we're enabling that balance sheet to settle, and how we're able to do so equitably. Matthew?
Hi. Thank you, Wes. So hi, I'm Matthew Lawrence. I'm President and CEO of Tollum. And Tollum is one of the companies that have received a grant from the HBAR SIF, so Sustainable Impact Fund. So we're part of that ecosystem. So in fact, a lot of what you'll see today is similar to what Wes has presented, but perhaps articulated more from the position of a product and something that's available currently in the market. Here we go. Excellent. So the opportunity we have is there is currently a voluntary carbon market. So $2 billion of assets are being traded. However, it doesn't have a great reputation. The perception is somewhat poor. And typically, this is because of bad quality assets being traded. Perhaps things don't exist. Perhaps they don't quite meet the marketing material that's being put out with them. And also a very poor transparency in the financial transactions that have taken place. So people have some impression that they're buying something for $15 or whatever it might be, that money is going to the communities, going to the people who've originated that asset. And in fact, often it doesn't, and it kind of disappears somewhere in the middle. So I think the opportunity we have is really to bring trust to this market, so that we can enable business leaders to meet their ESG goals in a scalable way, in a way that their stakeholders can admire. And then I think the flip side to that is it also allows consumers, real people, to participate in climate or the reduction of climate change and actually understand the impact that they're making. So at the moment, when we come to events like this, there's so much hope, there's so much enthusiasm and people doing things, but I often feel that it's somewhat a leap of faith that whatever they're doing actually leads to some kind of climate impact. It leads to the type of things that they're trying to achieve. So really, by making this transparent, by bringing this into the public light, we can help people quantify the impact that they're making. So really what Tolem is about is providing trusted assets, having them exchange equitably with trusted prices and at scale. So I can go through each of those items now. And the first is really the trusted assets. And this is where we use the HPAR or Hedera Guardian that Wes has just described. And really this is a workflow engine that allows each of the systems, the people, the sensors to have an identification, to input data into systems so we know exactly what data was available, at what point of the origination of an asset, and when various decisions were made. And by having this data set, it means that we can have an ecological verification of the asset. We can show that it actually has the climate impact that it's purporting to have. Now, as well as that, the way it does this is particularly important to Tolem because really what we're creating here is a set of data that is the asset. This is a virtual asset. It's a digital environmental asset. So it's really only described by the data. But the Hedera produces this in a way that that data is structured and that data is understandable or comparable. Okay, so structured means that we can then build automated workflows on top of that. Comparable means that we're able to effectively use that to compare the assets at scale. So without structured data, without comparable data, there is no scale. Okay, so as assets are produced, we believe that people will be able to build automated workflows to show the ecological veracity of those assets and really have trust that what they're selling or buying is actually what they purport it to be. Now, the next step is to have those trades done equitably. Okay, so here we're intending to bring to bear a payment flow which is on ledger, so it uses a stable coin, and effectively all the participants of the payment flow, so the people that will receive the money, can be identified prior to the purchase. So as somebody's assessing an asset to buy, they will understand exactly how that distribution of funds will be made. Then at purchase, the smart contract is executed, so people will then be able to verify that that distribution of funds has taken place. So what this means is that the projects that are originating the assets, entities associated with SDGs in those projects, their participation in the funds will be known at the point of purchase. People can take that into consideration. They can take that into consideration about whether to buy it, also about how much to pay for it. And those entities will have the money verifiably distributed to them. Okay, so instead of a very loose claim into marketing material, people will know exactly who's receiving the money as these assets are purchased. The next thing is that we want these exchanges to take place with trusted pricing. So a digital environmental asset, for example, a carbon credit, is an extremely complex asset. It has hundreds of attributes that are used to describe it. So it's very difficult for people to have an easy way to understand the pricing of that particular asset. So the example that Wes gave before was the housing market. So it's true that in a particular location, a 2-bedroom apartment could have a certain price. But really, in order to understand that in a global sense, you need the data for the entire housing market. You need to have those houses described in terms of their attributes, and you need a set of trading data from which you can extract the patterns to understand a predicted fair price. So that's what we've built. We've taken a large data set from the existing voluntary carbon market. We've articulated that data set in terms of the attributes of the assets it describes. And we've created a machine learning model that then means that for a given set of assets, people can have a predicted fair price. Then at the time of trade, we're able to share this information with both the buyer and the seller so that they can have a starting point for their negotiation to negotiate a fair trade. We reduce the friction of that trade and then hope those trades go through. As we move forward and we start to use more of the data from our own exchange, this means additional attributes such as financial equity. So for example, what percentage of the funds is going back to the communities can also be used in this machine learning model. So those types of attributes can also be used to help predict the fair price. So this means that as attractive things such as good quality assets with fair financial equity come to bear, then hopefully the price will be seen to increase and lift the market. The last thing is that this really needs to be done at scale. So if we think about the size of the problem in North America, for example, it's 5,500 million tons of carbon being emitted. So a carbon market that is intended to address that type of scale also has to have that kind of scale to do that. So this won't be done by small over-the-counter trades, people emailing PDFs, people buying tens of thousands of units. This has to be trading at scale. It has to be on screens of CFOs, of large organizations, and it has to tap into the capital reserves of those Fortune 500 companies. And really, the market at the moment is not set up to do that. It's not that kind of exchange. It's not how those CFOs would expect that market to be presented to them. So as we move forward and we continue to automate the technology, we bring to bear things such as what we call the ARM, so the Automated Regression Market Maker. And effectively, this builds on that structured data that I mentioned before. So now we have a set of assets and we're able to match buyers and sellers in the context of the buyer's preference. So the assets that they want, they can now describe in terms of those assets. They're then matched to the seller. We have a prediction of the price from the price oracle, and this means that we can start to move along the journey of automated trading. And by doing this, it means that we can tap into the types of activities that these large organizations do and make ourselves more attractive to those organizations. So I just have some description of each of these. So effectively, the trust in the asset is brought about from use of the Hedera Guardian and the way those assets are created. We have a price oracle. This takes in large amounts of historic trading data. It considers those in terms of the attributes and produces a predicted fair price for any given described asset. Trust in the transaction is where we have an automated payment or a transparent payment flow where the distribution of funds is known ahead of purchase of the asset. And then scale is where we bring these automated processes to bear to automate the trading to make it more in the line of typical processes for large capital reserves. So Toland's digital environmental asset platform has an API access to allow enterprises to effectively build it into their own workflow. So where we found particular interest from the market is where a workflow company is then understanding their carbon usage throughout their own processes and then buying offsets to match those processes as they undertake them. So this is what we call active offsetting. Okay, and really, I think it does several things. So first of all, by understanding how you're generating carbon within your organization and then assigning a cost to it, it means that you can effectively start the journey of decarbonization in a more effective way. So if you want to travel light, carry your own suitcase. So assign cost to the carbon that you're producing, and then you're able to basically deal with it in the same way that companies have been dealing with things or costs for the last 100 years. You assign it into budgets, you give targets for the year, and you give the task of reducing the carbon to the people who are designing the products, the people who are designing the manufacturing line, so the people that actually can make a change. And really, by assigning costs into a workflow situation, this encourages this behavior. So we believe this will lead to faster reductions in carbon for actual companies. The second thing that we do is that we provide APIs so that as people purchase carbon credits, the reporting is highly automated so that you can then run reports in line with your CDM reports or whichever reports you need to do for your annual reporting in an automated way. So typically currently this is a very arduous task. So because we have the information transparently on Ledger already, then those reports can be automatically generated, saving huge amounts of time for the enterprise. So an example of this in action is in fact the same example that Wes showed before. So this is the company Avery Dennison. And what they do is, as items move through their manufacturing flow, they give each item a identity. So it has a digital identity. Then as those items gets combined into finished goods, those processes are effectively understood in terms of their carbon content, and then they tokenize the carbon emissions of those processes. So what they're then able to do is, as we saw the demonstration before, tap into the Tala marketplace, and at any point in their manufacturing, buy the offsets in order to decarbonize that product. So this means that, first of all, they will understand the cost of carbon in their own manufacturing lines. They're then better able to reduce that carbon. And secondly, they can then sell goods on that have been decarbonized with the data to show that to be true. Okay, so Avery Dennison Atmore is one example of this. ServiceNow is a second example of this. So you can consider Avery Dennison to be a more manufacturing company. ServiceNow is in the IT space, so a lot of their activities is around IT services. So you can start to see how the decarbonization of services is possible. And then we have some other companies that are also integrating in their product flows. And on the supply side, we have extremely well-respected companies providing digital assets. So people like Olcott, Carbonoff, Regenium. These people have implemented the Guardian. So as they create their assets, they're creating this data set that will show the ecological veracity and then feed into the overall Tolland workflow. So one last slide about the opportunity to disrupt, because I think what we're moving to is the ability for individual people to make choices and understand the carbon content of those choices in a very granular way. So if we consider that a lot of the kind of discussion at conferences like this is that countries are decarbonizing or large enterprises, it's still very difficult for people on the street to connect to that. Okay, so if we consider Unilever, they have ESG goals that they will reduce by whatever it might be, 30% by a certain point in time. Now, for a person on the street, that's very hard to interact with. Unilever has hundreds of brands. It's even difficult in the store to know which items are Unilever. A 30% reduction is very difficult to understand in terms of, was it high before? Were they good before? Is that good? Should they be doing more? As a person, it's hard for me to interact with a company at that level. However, if their goods have been produced so that they have a barcode that allows me to see the carbon that was created during the production of this specific item and any carbon offsets that have been purchased to decarbonize this specific item, so a full trust chain, and I know that that item is now a decarbonized item, then in the store, I can choose that instead of something else. So I can participate in the improvement of climate change in a very individual and meaningful way. So this means that I, as a person, will be able to make my vote, make my impact felt, and hopefully move these larger companies into this direction of thinking. So carbon neutral products, this is what people like Atmore are moving towards, carbon neutral services, and then within organizations, carbon neutral functions. So this is a way for people to participate, I think, on a very meaningful level. In terms of where it's Tolland fit, so we have an enterprise platform. So as assets are sold and exchanged, then we're able to manage the exchange of those assets on Ledger. We have a price oracle, so we're able to recommend price. And this could be for assets that have not yet been created. So if you're a new project, then you can get information about choices that you're still able to make to understand the return on investment of those choices. It could be if you had a portfolio of goods, then you can have a continuous valuation of your portfolio. Or just at the time of trade, it can give you the information that helps you facilitate an easier trade. We have buy-sell matching. So because we now understand these attributes or these assets in a very granular way based on their attributes, we're better able to match buyers and sellers. If we go back to the example of real estate before. So if your apartment is close to a school and you have kids, then that could be a significant increase in the price that you would be willing to bear. If you're in an area that has a lot of retirees or older people, then probably that won't make a difference to the price. So by able to understanding the price in the context of the buyer and match buyers and sellers in that way, then you can create a much more meaningful market. Payments is where we have payment flows based on a very transparent distribution of funds. Retirement is where we're able to retire the goods, where we can retire specifically against an emission, so that if you're then selling your good, you're able to see the full trust chain all the way from emission to retirement of offsets against that emission. And reporting APIs is where we're able to help large enterprise effectively reduce their cost, report their ESG activity in a far more efficient way. So thank you very much. That is Talem. If there's any questions, I would love to take them. Thank you. Hello.
So about the pricing yesterday, were you actually calculating fair pricing based on the cost curve of this project, or market price, basically the price market is actually transacting at this point in time?
So it's fair market pricing. So it's market price. So it's based on historic transactions, and then an understanding of those transactions in the context of what was sold, i.e. the attributes of those assets that were sold. So we don't, for example, understand for a particular country the cost of labor is higher, so their assets must be higher. But if that was reflected in the market, so if their things do sell, then that would be reflected in our model. Thank you.
Thank you.